Hello everyone, my name is Ben Eady and I'm the Online Media Manager for ModernAnalyst.com, the premier online community for business analysts. I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar titled A Modern Take on the Agile Manifesto for Today's BA. Today's featured speakers are Derwin Harris and Ashley Lund from JAMA Software. The webinar will last approximately 60 minutes, including the Q&A session. So make sure to submit your questions in advance using the questions feature of the webinar software. I'd also like to say thank you to JAMA Software for sponsoring this event. And at this time, I'll turn it over to Derwin to get us started.
Hello, everybody. Derwin Harris here, and welcome to today's webinar. So today we'll be looking back. Well, we're going to try and figure out how the past 14 years since the manifesto has changed, and really how that change impacts how we go forward. This webinar is really geared towards anyone who finds themselves in that dubious position of defining a set of requirements for a product. And when I say requirements, I'm using a broad sense to define really when you're defining the what and the why. And when I say BA, I'm also defining that role in a much broader sense, because today there really are a lot of folks out there who wouldn't really call themselves a business analyst, though there are those who call themselves business analysts. But you're all sort of finding yourselves in this position where you're struggling to sort of understand and define where you fit in the bigger picture in the organization with engineering and the business side of the house. So I'm hoping to sort of cover those kinds of topics today in this effort of looking back. So my name, as you know, is Derwin Harris, and I'm a co-founder here and a product manager at JAMA Software. I've been working and observing for really the last 20 years in what I might call an industry of software and products. I've worked on numerous teams, seeing epic failures and even at great successes. I've been on Agile projects, I've been on waterfall projects, rational unified projects of all things, and lots of numerous ad hoc hybrid projects. I feel like I've been really lucky in my career to have worked with so many customers, often on a one-on-one basis, to really understand their process and helping them find ways to improve. One final slide before we really dive into the webinar itself is just a little bit about who we are. We're JAMA Software, and we're based in Portland, Oregon. We've been in business since 2006, and we've really worked with over 600 customers where our software has been used in a broad range of different products and projects, ranging from commercial space travel to smartphones to embedded medical devices, resulting in thousands of users relying on the tool. And this is really what's given us that insight, because we've been able to work with and partner with and interact with so many different industries and types of companies frustrated and working with different processes out there. So this has been very exciting for us. So what does it really mean to take a modern look at the Agile Manifesto? Why does it even matter? And I really think when I thought about this, there's four key reasons, of which I'll go into detail throughout this presentation. The first is really fundamental in that the world has changed in the last 14 years, and it's changed dramatically, and it's changed in a way that's impacted how teams work. The second is that software is everywhere. It's in everything we do. We as consumers are interacting and buying software more than ever before. It's part of our daily lives, and this has a dramatic impact on the companies that exist today and what companies are trying to do. Third is that complexity has increased. It's increased in a lot of different ways, and it's not to say that there wasn't complexity back in 2001, but there are some really clear differences in terms of how products and organizations are much more complex today that could warrant a rethink and a relook at how the manifesto or how we define what a process is. And lastly, projects still fail. This is sort of that amazing thing where we continue to run these studies and look at projects and see that they're failing. But the real question is, why are they failing, and what do we mean by failure? And is it even possible to consider a time in the future where we see 100% success, where projects can be so predictable as in building a house? Can we get past this? And so before I move on to go into the details of those individual items, I'd like to just do a quick poll. Now that I've highlighted those four items, if you could take a moment and just tell me which one do you think has had the biggest impact on process and methodology over the last 14 years. And you can think about it in terms of your sort of experience and career of which of these things do you see as having the biggest impact on maybe just your job and your life. And let me see, is that poll going on right now?
Yes, it is, Derwin. We'll close it here in just a moment.
All right, sounds good. Wasn't sure if I should stall for time. And if you could, I'm not seeing the polls, so if you could just sort of let me know what the results are once we get the results. Some of these are somewhat unrelated, related. It'll be interesting to kind of see what people see as an impact. One of the things as a side note is if you, after the webinar, or even in the comment stream, or even in the question stream, do you think there's other things that you think are having an impact on your role and your job, that's sort of external forces? Post those out there, because I'm always curious in hearing what other folks think is having these impacts on their world.
Okay, Derwin, we have 48% say complexity has increased. Software is everywhere is 21%. The world has changed 13%, and projects still fail is 17%.
Nice. Yeah, and that's actually kind of what I would expect. Is the complexity is that thing which we've identified in talking to a lot of folks as being the thing that's really driving change, because complexity is different. And I'll sort of go into details. It'll be curious to sort of see what you see as being what facilitates that complexity, but we'll get into that. So that's interesting. That's great to know. So let's go through these in a bit more detail. The world has, in fact, dramatically changed. We're radically connected as a result of modern technology. We have invented ways to connect that are unthinkable back in 2001. From online storage, if you can think about things like Dropbox, Google Docs, the cloud, to social networks, Snapchat, Twitter, Facebook. Not only has this changed how we work, it's true for how we communicate with customers in general. The customer voice is much more empowered than ever and more able to share opinions with us and everyone else about the product that we haven't had in the past. And so this has created dramatic changes in terms of how we interact with things. Oops, not letting me move forward. All right. So if we look at this in a little more detail as far as what was it like back in 2001, and this is just for more of an exercise of reminding us, because it's amazing how much has changed, of what was the world back in 2001 when the manifesto was actually written. And if we think about the sort of smartphone, the Ericsson R380, I don't know if anyone out there ever had this, it was released in 2001, laying claim to the term smartphone. It was the first phone that really considered itself a smartphone. And what was interesting is what made it a smartphone was very limited capability. It's just the fact that it was small was that category. And really, this is the camera that came into the phone was in the J phone, and that was in Japan. We didn't even see that until 2004. So it really was very limited compared to what we think of today. The other idea is this whole notion of social. It was an unknown term. Even MySpace didn't exist at that time. The closest we could come to that is Wikipedia, which existed, or maybe instant messaging applications like ICQ. So the whole notion of social was completely foreign to us at that point in time. Music is another interesting area where it just the big event of 2001 was the iPod. Napster had just sort of taken the industry by storm, starting in '99 and leading into 2001, and then the iPod came out, and really things were never the same. And this was one of those first true disruptions that we saw in the current decade. .com at the time was a big buzzword, and AOL was at its peak. I went back and looked at some research as far as when did AOL start to go downhill, and it started to go downhill in 2001. It was at its peak user base in 2001, and it just went down from there. Lastly, companies were really undergoing a shift. You know, there was all these .com companies. Google was only 400 employees. And the whole idea of creating creative workspaces, implementing Agile, and rethinking how companies actually fundamentally operate from an organizational standpoint was dramatically changing. It was undergoing a revolution of how companies think. We had very traditional companies in the way they worked with hierarchical structures that were based off of sort of the Ford industry, and all of a sudden we were in this opportunity in this moment of time when that was all shifting. And so if we jump forward to today in 2014, things look a lot different. You know, mobile phones are no longer just phones. They are tablets, movies, photos, GPS, and we're really on the cusp of a whole nother revolution with wearables, where all of a sudden the idea of how we're interacting with our world is embedded in what we wear, and that's huge dramatic changes to how we interact with each other. The idea of social is now a name that we all know and think about all the time. We've got Facebook. It's ubiquitous within our environment, and it has fundamentally changed how we communicate. There's a group for everyone. There is a place for everyone to go and communicate and share information, from dog lovers to sports fanatics to business analysts. And so this has created a community in which we can learn and uncover and understand things in a much deeper way. And of course, music is a great example because it continues to change dramatically. The revolution that occurred back in 2001 is now going through another revolution where online music and streaming and just the fact that we have access to it on a much broader scope is dramatic. And it's, again, an example of how companies are changing, because Spotify is a great example of a company that's operating on a very different way organizationally. And then there's this whole concept of Internet of Things, and this is going to tie to the idea of complexity, because no longer are we in that .com, because the whole notion of .com, which is very a browser-based aspect of interacting with users and people, we're now talking about how things are interacting. We are no longer the primary subject of how things are communicating. You've got Nest, you've got all the phones, everything in which we're communicating is now through items. Your refrigerator is talking to the cloud and sharing with other refrigerators to help understand and help learn. Tesla is communicating with their other phones. So it's an amazing shift that we're seeing right now. And so let's go into some of these in more detail, that the fact that software is in fact everywhere. We partnered with Forrester on a survey that found that 23% of products now contain software. Amazon has changed the book selling and really the everything selling industry with software. Airbnb is disrupting the hotel industry. And we're just starting to see these kinds of disruptions in things like the banking industry, where platforms like Simple and Square are changing how we engage in financial institutions. The industry is really ripe for this kind of work. There was a Viacom study recently that found that 4 out of 10 most hated brands by millennials were banks. And so this is an interesting shift that we're starting to see, driven primarily by software. And so software is making huge changes in our world. If we look at a couple of examples, I think the most obvious ones of the two that I picked out was automotive and banking. In the automotive industry, if you think back on 2001, there really was minimal software embedded in the cars. There was just some software that enabled us. I was focused mostly on entertainment. But now you think about what the software does in the cars, the navigation, the dashboard, satellite radio, backup cameras, automatic brakes, and soon they could be driving themselves, all of which are software driven. I think there's a great example in Tesla, because Tesla has really created an ecosystem around its car. It's not selling cars with embedded software. It is creating an ecosystem of a vehicle, a bunch of vehicles that all interact with each other. There's an example where I was looking at an article that was written March 28th by the Detroit News, where it was describing how the federal safety regulators had closed the investigation around the fires, if you recall the fires that were occurring. And it was because they were able to provide a software update to the cars that solved the problem. There was no need for a recall because Tesla had the ability to update the cars live. And I find that amazing. The other thing that was interesting about the article was that Tesla was able to report back to the National Highway Transportation and Safety Association that their fleet, as they called it, had logged 90 million miles since the reports of the fires last year. What that tells me is that the cars are all communicating via the cloud back to Tesla. And so it has a notion of its fleet. It has an ecosystem of vehicles of which when you buy the car, you become part of. That is a fundamental different way of selling a car. The financial industry is also undergoing dramatic changes. It's become less and less important for consumers to have face-to-face interactions at their bank simply because of mobile banking. Deposits using your camera phone, apps that allow you to budget and transfer money. And this really has banks deeply concerned. They're simply not prepared to become software companies. There was an article I found in the Bloomberg View regarding ATMs back in the 70s and 80s. The ATMs ushered in this explosive growth that they deemed retail finance. And retail finance is really what created the service industry that the banks currently rely on. Well, that's all changing now, and they need to react, and they need to become a software company. So let's look at complexity, and complexity is the thing that everyone online today felt was one of the biggest changes that they've experienced. It has increased. The idea, we did a survey that found that 55% of companies had over 100 products, and 87% of those companies had multiple teams working on those projects. So when I think about complexity, complexity has really been broken down into two categories. One is the product, and the other really is the company. So from a product perspective, the complexity is around the technology that we're working with, the frameworks that are available. Open source created tons of possible frameworks that we can use to do different things, different JavaScript frameworks, Java frameworks. There's all sorts of ways in which we can use technology to enable us to do what we need to do. And while that's made it possibly easier for our developers, it's made the whole idea of creating a project more complex because you have more options. The other big change is just the sheer number of platforms that we need to support. When you think about the Internet of Things, that's a whole level of complexity of it's no longer IE6 that we need to support. Back in 2001, IE6 was the only browser that existed. They had won the browser wars at that time, and that dramatically changed to where we're at today, where it's no longer really even about the browsers. It's about your mobile phone. It's about what you're wearing in the future. So the other idea is that companies are now focusing more on innovation. They're realizing that they can't rely on sort of working with specific customers or working on contracts. They need to rely on being innovative, being ahead of the curve. And this is what Apple's ushered in, is this idea that you can't rely on what someone wants. You have to think ahead on what they need. And that's a different mindset that people are getting into, and it's changing how, and it's making it more complex for us to be able to build. And then the last is this idea of a larger ecosystem. When you're building a product, it's no longer a product that you're selling that sits on a shelf that has a price point and it sells, and then you're making another product. It's an ecosystem that you're creating. You're creating an ecosystem around something. You're creating a community around something, and that, again, is involving the entire company. So when we think about the company has dramatically changed. We now have distributed teams much more so than we ever did in the past. Now, of course, there were distributed teams before, but all of a sudden today, we now have the ability to communicate across those distributed teams in a much more efficient way because of the technology that's evolved over the time and because of the sort of the acceptance of collaborating remotely. The middle point that I call out here, the company involvement, is really important to highlight because I think traditionally when you think about products being implemented, there was a notion that it was focused on the engineering team or that there was a separation between the business side of the house and the engineering side of the house. And I'll get more into detail about this as we look deeper into the Agile Manifesto, but suffice it to say that in today's modern organizations, in order to build products, there is a company involvement. It's not just the business analyst, it's not just the engineering team, it's the entire company that needs to be involved to sort of facilitate and manage the product that's being delivered, because you need that innovation, you need that feedback loop, and that requires the entire company to be involved. And that's as well why companies need to really monitor and understand and avoid the risk of disruption. And so the last one is really the notion that, yes, projects still fail. I found an interesting study here as well where they were saying that Agile had a 72% success rate, which is great. I think that's positive. But they were saying this is compared to traditional methodologies having a 64% success rate. What I found interesting in this, and a little shocking, was that in the last 14 years, that's about a 9% increase in success. That seems to me not a lot in comparison. It tells me that traditional methodologies had a pretty good success rate, not a great success rate, but even 72% is not the best. It's a passing grade, right? We need, how do we get better, and how do we understand this distinction and what this means in terms of Agile methodology versus other methodologies. And so if we look at some of the reasons why projects fail to sort of understand this, because the notion is they still fail, and we want to really look at why that might be in sort of this modern world. One is that the teams are really out of sync. And this is not just about development teams. It's about cross-department, business to engineering, executive to employee. It's about the company ecosystem. I've heard and seen this time and time again. An engineering team being agile only makes them agile, but it doesn't make the company agile. The process or methodology selected should take into consideration the entire organization. And that's a conversation that needs to be had by the entire organization, not just one team or the other. The second is that there are no silver bullets. And I know that this has been around since Fred Brooks wrote about it in 1986. And still true today. There are no silver bullets. And as soon as we think that there's a silver bullet, we're immediately putting ourselves at risk of failure. And I think that's just something to constantly remind ourselves of. The third is somewhat of an interesting and somewhat of a new concept, and that is that decisions have really big impacts. There's quite a few articles out there, and if you look around, you'll find, and even if you look within your own environment, there are decisions being made every single day. And these decisions are fundamental in the success of your project. They are what are enabling you to move forward, or they're causing you to end up in the wrong direction. Right? And these huge impacts have an impact on your ultimate outcome. And so in analyzing and realizing that decisions are part of the problem and part of the success will help you sort of understand, and I'll get into a little more detail with that as well. The last is I think, hopefully, fairly obvious. People matter. People within the organization matter deeply. You can't simply put a process in place that overrides the fact that people are the ones that are ultimately doing the work. It's important that people are taken into consideration in terms of how they work and how they interact with each other. The other notion of project failure is that the definition itself of failure has shifted. You know, we really had this notion of minimum viable product, and the Agile Manifesto said working software. And so I think it's important to analyze what does this mean, and to analyze within your own organization, what does it mean to provide working software? What is the purpose of providing working software? Minimum viable product has its own definition, that it has to have some value associated with it. And so this is important. Failure can be used as part of a feedback loop. And I think this is important as well, because if done right, failure can provide valuable information. It's all about how you put something out there and the expectations that you set. As a business analyst, you're not just defining what needs to be built, but you are also designing the expectations. It's your role that can help define what outcomes or what reactions are expected. And it's your role that needs to work with the rest of the org to incorporate that feedback. Right? So here again is that we're taking the idea of failure and using that as a way of improving the product. But that requires an understanding of the process of how we're incorporating that feedback, and that requires a constant loop and incorporation of the rest of the organization. And so the last is that what you do next matters, and I think that's sort of following up on what I'm saying, is that if you treat failure as this learning experience, you have to then understand and react and realize what you do next matters. Is what is your reaction to that information, and how are you prepared? And you have to think ahead in terms of defining what your reaction is going to be. So if we look at, this is sort of a question I like to ask. Is the manifesto agile, or as, I knew I was going to mess up saying this, but is the manifesto agile, or is agile the manifesto? And what I ultimately mean by this is, to what degree have we relied on others to define what works for us? How has the world changed such that the concept of agile or the methodology of agile should adapt? And that's really the notion here. And so what I want to do is dive into the manifesto and take a look at each line from the perspective of 2001 to today, to sort of understand how we might adapt and evolve. So taking this in piecemeal. In 2001, we'll look at that first line. In 2001, we were much more like individuals. Interactions were limited to face-to-face, phone, IM, or email. Waterfall, at its core, was designed to limit interactions by creating these stage gates. And so Agile's intent here was to encourage more teamwork, ultimately. But because options were limited, many relied on creating these central open locations for people to sit together. And this really didn't scale well to the rest of the organization, because it didn't incorporate the entire company. And really, BAs were one of those roles that kind of felt left out. And I know I've worked in these environments where as soon as we decided we were Agile, the first thing we did was brought all the developers into a single room. And that's the extent of bringing everybody into the single room. In addition, process and tools meant something very different in 2001. Tools were cumbersome and few. Process was heavy. and very manual with lots of steps and details, and focus more really on CYA and quality over getting it right, which getting it right is really what the Agile Manifesto was proposing. And tools didn't really drive the process like they do today. You had rational, which was definitely driving rational unified process, but you didn't have the extent of the tools that we see today that are really driving and built off of the existing process. And so if we look at that in another way, if we look at this in 2014 to sort of understand, well, how can we interpret this in today's 2014 modernized world? You know, teams have become more complex, as we talked about, but our options to interact have increased as well. Not only that, but our understanding and acceptance of interacting through a medium has dramatically changed and continues to change. So one of the ideas I'll be floating here is the notion that the manifesto, in attempting to describe one over another, albeit with a disclaimer at the bottom, which may have caused some of the confusion, I've used the term combined with or balanced with in some of these other slides. And mainly because I was thinking about this idea, I realized that each side had changed and progressed such that it became evident we should be considering them in partnership. This is a perfect example where in the manifesto, process and tools were considered the lesser of the two. But considering the complexity of products and teams discussed before, and the fact that tools themselves have matured greatly, we are now at a point where process and tools should be equally considered alongside individuals and interactions. In fact, in today's world, they are tightly coupled. The last line is, for me, the most ironic. Some have argued that the reason Agile teams fail is because they did not follow the process strictly enough. And this may be true, but that logic sort of goes against the manifesto itself, doesn't it? I mean, that's sort of the question I'm asking, is I believe that the process is important consideration. In fact, it's impossible not to have some kind of process. In fact, the methodologies and the Agile methodologies that you see today are, in fact, a process. So again, looking back at 2001 on the next line, and this one is actually my favorite because I believe this one is the most widely debated and has had the greatest impact on the BA community. The notion that the documentation should be replaced by working software. Of course, back in 2001, software was a simpler concept, not to belittle the products of the time. I'm sure there were complex software projects. Still, the mindset at the time was to document everything up front and then go build, and oftentimes resulting in building the wrong thing. There was an interesting conversation I had seen online with Alistair Coburn around the word comprehensive and the decision to use the word comprehensive. It was actually highly debated when they were developing the manifesto, according to him. And the reason for that is they didn't want people to think that documentation was not necessary. They still felt that there was a reason for documentation. And so they thought using the term comprehensive would be a way of indicating to folks that, look, there is a reason for documentation, just not comprehensive documentation. But I think that that really got lost in the mix a little bit, at least in a lot of the debates that I've seen and been part of. And so today we have much more complex software. We have things like minimum viable product. We have things like continuous delivery. So suddenly the idea of working software is much more a reality. And for me, this does not change the importance of documentation. What does change is the notion of the word document. You know, whether you're using a whiteboard, Post-it notes, wiki, or some tool, you are in fact documenting. And this is a critical and necessary aspect of your process. The ability to respond to change, to interact, in fact, everything the Agile Manifesto believes in is around our ability to communicate and collaborate around something. That something is what you're writing down or documenting. It's the ideas, it's the stories, it's the epic, it's the decisions that we write and make every single day. And so we have to remember and keep in mind that documenting is critical to enabling us to be more innovative and to react to things. That has to be captured somewhere, somehow. And so if we again look at the next line, 2001, this is another good one that was clearly a reaction of the times. I've experienced this before too, where a contract is made, it's signed, budgets are defined, timelines are defined, and then as a developer, I'm expected somehow to deliver what the contract states within the time that it states at the budget that it states. Agile's solution was to have the customer on site in lieu of these contracts, which I think is a very noble cause. The reality, though, is that in some industries, contracts are still necessary. You just can't get away from it. And sometimes they are part of a vendor selection process. Sometimes they are part of regulatory requirements. And really, regarding having the customer on site, the net result, as I experienced in some cases, was that we had these proxy customers, some individual that was intended to represent the customer's viewpoint. But that had its own issues by creating this sort of central point of failure, that we're relying on this single person to understand and comprehend what the customer base needs. Really, ultimately, I felt that this is where the business analyst was marginalized, because it's that role that has to be able to communicate between the business and the technical side, to be able to extract out from the customer the problems that they're experiencing and understand and define exactly what the solution should be, not what the customer exactly wants. And I'll get into a bit more detail with this as well as we talk about how we might look at this in 2014. So today a lot has changed around collaboration. So just even the term collaboration has changed. And so there's a notion to rethink this as well. The customer, and I don't know if you can see me, but I'm using air quotes around customer, because the idea of a customer has dramatically changed. Our customer, it could be a market. It could be an industry. It could be a wide group of people. It could be a segment that we're talking about. It may even be a segment that doesn't exist yet that you want to create. And so how do you bring that customer into the fray when that segment doesn't even exist? So it's no longer as clear who this customer is. And so our ability to discuss remotely is realistic and a viable option, and this enables us to really start the communication process. But this hasn't removed the necessity, in some industries especially, for a contract. What has changed is the ability to combine the collaboration with the contract process so that it represents a continued means of communication. And this sort of ties into the whole negotiation aspect. Negotiation is just another term, in my mind, for collaboration. When I'm working with somebody and I'm collaborating with them, I am oftentimes negotiating with them. We are engaging in a debate in an attempt to understand and define the real problems that we're trying to solve. And this is, again, an example where the business analyst has a critical role in that process to ensure that we're in constant negotiation, constant collaboration with the customer or with the market to really understand and make sure that we're all in alignment and all on the same page. So really, the contract can change. The contract can become this sort of thing that we work with together throughout the entire process. It has to be something that we can go back to and adapt along the way as necessary. So I agree 100% with the idea that contracts are bad if they're treated with this signed, sealed, and delivered mentality. There has to be some aspect of being able to adjust and go back to that information. So looking at this, this last line in the Agile Manifesto, this is another one of my personal favorites because, again, the whole idea of over really marginalizes the value of a plan. I understand the reasoning back in 2001. There was a perception then that oftentimes in reality that a plan represented the final work and was treated like a gate into this black box of engineering. And when we create these plans and we send them off, the development team is expected to build it, and they're going to build it based off of their interpretation of the plan. And so there's a lot of books and courses that talk about how we write information or how we define these plans in order to create this legal jargon that's attempting to not be ambiguous or misleading. And there's all this effort and work around defining the plan in such a way that we don't mislead, such that engineering can interpret it correctly, because it does go into this black box. And so there was all this risk mitigation around the plans to ensure that once it's handed off to development, they get it right. So Agile really wanted to change that by enabling that communication to go forward. But I still think that there's a value in having a plan altogether. And so that's why when we look at this in 2014, it's really, as I mentioned, it's about success versus failure in how we react to it, and it's about what we do next. The key is to understand the change, and this requires some skills from people who understand how to get at the core of that change, right? We don't want to just simply react to every little bit of change. We have to use change as a means for having a conversation, for having or making a decision on something. And really, when you think about a plan, the question I have is, how can there not be a plan? There must, in my mind, be a plan. No matter the size of the project, there must be some kind of plan. It might be a plan written on a napkin. There is always going to be a plan, and it's important to refer back to that plan often to avoid drifting away from that plan. And if you are drifting away, that could very well be okay. It just means that you need to adjust and modify the plan, because you are going to learn, if you're adapting these Agile methodologies, the Agile principles, you are going to learn as you go through this process, as you're creating minimal products, as you're either succeeding or failing, or as you're doing these feedback loops, you're going to learn, and you want to make sure that you're constantly referring back to that plan, because the plan is ultimately the business side of the house saying, this is why we think we need to build this thing. So ultimately, change and vision go hand in hand, and that we need to be working together to constantly evaluate and understand what we're building and why. I would even argue that it's not change we're responding to, but decisions, and decisions cannot be answered in a vacuum, right? They require an understanding of the business value we are trying to solve. And this, again, requires someone who understands that distinction. So what's next in the world of methodologies? Really, where are we going, and how does this impact you as a business analyst? This is sort of a broad, dangerous statement. Here at JAMA, we refer to it as modern product delivery. And this is something that we've been working a lot with Forrester on as we've sort of evaluated the different processes and methodologies, trying to understand really what is the broad scope of what we're trying to solve. And ultimately, it's about a process that involves the entire organization, that really takes into consideration the collaboration, the people, the organizational structures within the organization. And so it's not just about engineering per se, it's about the entire organization. And so if we look at some different nuances or things that we might expect in the future around methodologies, there's a couple interesting bits of information. One is that we're seeing today that data and science is going to help us drive some of those decisions. We have a wealth of data available to us. We've heard about big data. We've heard about the fact that Tesla's gathering so much information from their fleet. This is the kind of thing that's going to help drive product decisions and product understanding. And so all of a sudden, when you think about your plan and your contract, data is a critical aspect of maintaining and understanding how that's being implemented. Culture will continue to be a focus. We've seen that that's been evolving. I think it hasn't been evolving fast enough, but culture is one of those things that those successful companies are really taking seriously. They're looking at their culture. They're looking at those infrastructures. And this isn't just about having video games within your place or smoothies. It's about how your folks work together in an empowered, creative, innovative way. And this is something that's not easy to call out in a methodology or in a process, but it's something organizations are taking very seriously. Individual behavior will be a driver. And what I mean by this is that individuals, millennials, I suppose, is really the term that you might use for them, are able to interact differently. They are very adept at using collaborative type software. And so they're going to come into your workforce and demand that kind of interaction. They're not going to want to rely on decades-old technology to interact. Part of what makes them motivated and interesting is working with cool, innovative software within their environment. And so that's something to consider as well. So this, again, ties back to the fact that process and tools is actually very important to consider and shouldn't be considered less so. The last is that solutions and tools will take a larger role. We have seen a ton of solutions being developed and built out there, and that is, again, because our world is surrounded by software, and people are used to and almost demand having software to help them do what they need to do best. It's nice. I love whiteboards. Don't get me wrong, but whiteboards are great for those meeting conversations, those understanding of detailed problems, but they're not the place of record for complex projects. You need tools and software to accomplish that. And so I'm going to wrap up here with a few recommendations that I hope will be helpful in going forward. So one is, take a moment, pause, and rethink. Rethink, if you look at your environment, look at what you're doing, and decouple for a moment the manifesto from Agile. And this isn't to say that anything's incorrect about it. It's just decouple them for a moment and really look at the process that you're doing, whatever that process might be. You might call it Agile, you can call it hybrid, whatever you call that process, and just decouple it from a moment from the manifesto and think about your world today, right? It's just looking at the types of people, the culture, the way in which you communicate, and all of that, and trying to think of that more abstractly. Continue to shift your understanding of failure, right? So look at how you're releasing information, and especially look at how you're reacting to the release of that information. If you are, in fact, providing some form of working software at some incremental time, it's important that you understand how you're reacting to that. It's not enough to just simply say, well, we produce working software on every sprint we produce working software. It's what are you doing as an organization to react to that information, and how do you adapt and how do you change? Evaluate your current communication modes. Look within your organization and understand, how are people communicating? Are you an organization that loves to do meetings? Are you an organization that loves to talk on IM? Are there emails? And this is an area where data might actually be really important to gather. It might be worth, as an organization, looking at the number of emails that are sent and the number of reply alls that are sent, and understanding what kind of conversations happen via email versus IM versus any solution that you may have, because you may find that decisions are being made in those vacuums, and that's where you run into delays and or misses, because not everyone is aware of that decision that was being made. The last is to track metrics and use them to iterate your process. So metrics are a critical aspect, and this goes back to that idea of data, is they give you that base from which you can think and move forward, right? If you do not have metrics, then it's an emotional game of trying to determine which direction you want to go in. Metrics can have their own risk if interpreted incorrectly. So I do caution a little bit that, be sure to debate and negotiate what the metrics mean, and that way everyone has a say in interpreting and understanding what they mean. And the last is to think of Agile from an organization perspective. And I know that there's been a lot of folks that have done this, and I think those conversations are fantastic, because the more we can start spreading the idea, because ultimately I have faith and belief in the notions and the ideas behind the manifesto. And the more we can use that to broaden the perspective around the entire organization, the more that it's going to mature. And I've seen this more and more over the past years, and I think that's a positive trend. There was a great quote from CIO online. It said, ultimately, organizations should invest more in preparing leaders and creative teams, and should not invest too much in another methodology, or may not work for them. So it's, again, focusing on your teams and really understanding and helping them work through and define the process. So another is step 2, communication. And I know I'm stressing this idea of communication. It's because I'm very passionate about this idea. I think ultimately the heart of everything is communication, and how communication takes place, and making sure that you have correct ways of facilitating that communication. And so to do that, there's a couple tips on improving that, or understanding what that is find ways to constantly provide visibility. Communication cannot take place if there's no visibility. There has to be visibility into what you're working on, even though it may be in its draft mode. And this, again, goes back to the notion of sharing information early and often. Find ways to allow communication and opinions to flow freely. I think I've heard from folks that there's a fear that the noise level of that open communication will hinder progress. I have not found this to be the case. And I think that there's ways in which you can, I'd rather work backwards from that, and I think I identified that here. That's actually in the next step, so I'll talk about that in a moment. But allow that information to flow freely. If, in fact, it is becoming overwhelming, then find ways to filter that information down to the relevancy of it. But having that wealth of information is a fantastic starting point. Take the example of just your customers. Your customers could be interacting with you through tons of mediums, whether it's through Twitter, Facebook, on your forums. However, that is a wealth of information. It is not valid to say that you would wish they would not be interacting with you. It's more valid to say, this is a great set of information. How am I going to distill this down to its relevancy? Identify where decisions. I've stressed throughout this presentation the idea and the notion of decisions. That decisions are, in fact, critical to the success of your project. You will find that decisions are happening everywhere. They're happening on IM. They're happening in email. They're happening in meetings. And these decisions are what are causing your project or your product to what I call, or what we call here, drift, to go in one direction or the other. This is where change occurs. And so understanding and knowing where those decisions are taking place is critical, and will be even more critical going forward as we become more agile, as we become more iterative. Constantly ask if people understand not only what they're doing and why. Sorry, there's a typo here. I'm just realizing this is, but constantly ask if people understand not only what they're doing, but why. Right? So this is, again, I think we tend to, there's a lazy aspect to doing simply what we're told. There's an opportunity from a company perspective to empower and motivate by enabling folks at every level to understand why they're doing what they're doing. Right? And that creates a organization of empowerment and understanding and alignment that ultimately drives creativity, innovation, and success. So that's part of that aspect. Last, step 3, open up the dialogue to culture. Enable, embrace process. And this is, again, just iterating the fact that process is fundamental. We require an understanding, and this is where you can focus on making people more efficient. If the process is well defined and everyone's following that same process, then people can be more free to collaborate and innovate and not have to worry about figuring out and trying to understand how they work in one environment or another, or being confused by where to find something. Process is what gives us guidelines in order to be more collaborative and more innovative. Communicate, communicate, communicate. I can't stress it enough. Write things down early, get it down, write it down, document it. If you do whiteboards, take photos, post those photos up there. Content and data is incredibly valuable if it's made available. Put it in a shared place. And this goes back to what I was saying, is start with too much. Don't worry about the fact that there's a ton of information out there. Having a ton of information is a great starting point. The next step is how you take that information and make it useful. And this is why we're seeing a lot of new roles evolving in the workforce. There's things like data research analysts, there's data scientists. These are folks that really have learned how to use mathematical properties to understand and determine what data looks like and how to analyze that data correctly. This is sort of a trend in the industry, namely because there's so much information out there and it's providing value. So I will leave with one more slide, and this is meant to be a little tongue-in-cheek, but I've been playing around with the manifesto today, kind of hinting at some notions and some different ways of thinking about it. And really, I don't mean any disrespect or any, but I think it's always been seen to me as a guide. And assuming that we're constantly iterating, and assuming that we're doing retrospectives, and assuming that the world is in fact changing, it will evolve, and it will evolve into a point where you're finding more success. And so I recommend reading the manifesto, but read it in a way that you can understand it, explore it, question it, and just question how you can be better. And so as sort of a tongue-in-cheek, I played around with some areas that I might see changes, such as things, teams, the whole balance with capturing content and solutions, and ultimately defining a vision. So hopefully people find that funny. But let's leave with this. This is us at Jama Software. Our philosophy is that we really believe in building great products. You can always go to our website. You can try our software for free. I highly encourage you. We're very passionate about process and team success. And with that, I'm going to open it up to questions.
Great. Thanks, Derwin. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So we have had a lot of questions come in, and we'll try to get through as many of them as possible. But if we don't get to your question, we will be sure to follow up with you offline. We just have quite a few questions for the time that we have for the live Q&A session. Just another note, if you guys could use the questions box in the GoToWebinar panel to ask any additional questions you'd like me to ask Derwin now, please do so. And the other thing to note, there's been a lot of questions about the slides and the presentation if it's being recorded. That's also going to be made available on Modern Analyst's website. So the first question that we have is, my organization is resistant to change. Do you have any tips for starting the conversation to get them on board with a new take like this on the manifesto?
Yeah, and I hear that a lot from some folks. It depends on the organization, of course, and I think this goes back to the trends that we're seeing in organizations in general, that organizations are, as an organization, they're shifting. And so if you're in an organization that is, in fact, resistant to change, it could very well be an uphill battle. And it really oftentimes depends on who you are and where you're at within your organization to the degree that you can help facilitate that change. So I don't know if I have an easy answer for that. It's oftentimes a matter of looking for the champions out there that can help with that. It could be that there's an opportunity to do sort of ground-up type change, and I think that that's been one of the wonderful things that I've seen with Agile is it's really empowered development teams to embrace these different, much more collaborative processes, and that in itself is what's driving a lot of the organizations to adapt. And so that's something I didn't really mention in the webinar, but I think that one of the great things that has happened in the last 14 years is that the notion of the Agile Manifesto and the notion of implementing these processes enabled sort of the ground-up process to sort of work its way into an organization. And now organizations are having these dialogues simply because they're wanting to adapt and interact with the engineering team on a better level. And that's ultimately going to make them more successful, because I think part of why that percentage of 72% success rate is on some level related to the fact that not the entire organization is bought into it.
Great. So the next question is, it's about different methodologies, and specifically, like, what about when different teams are using different methodologies? Is it still relevant, or sorry, is this methodology still relevant to teams that aren't using Agile?
I think so. I think so, namely because Agile, again, this is just, I'm assuming that the term Agile is being referred to as the process Agile and not necessarily the concepts of Agile. And that's one thing that I'm always trying to sort of clarify when we're talking about something, because the term, the process, the methodology of Agile is defined in a lot of books, and there's different variances of it, and there's rules in which you follow to adhere to this process of which Agile is defining. And there could be a team that's utilizing that. What I've seen in a lot of instances is that when you've got organizations, especially organizations that are building products that include both hardware and software, the software team has a much easier time being agile from a process standpoint, whereas the hardware team has a harder time because they can't do all the same things. They can prototypes and build, so there's a lot more upfront documentation understanding that they have to go through. And that's a reality for a lot of organizations. So this is, again, an example where if you decouple yourself from Agile for a moment and really look at how you're interacting from a communication standpoint, you will find that the way in which you interact with each other, there are clear communication points and points of collaboration and points of interaction that need to be facilitated, right? It's not so much about, I'm on this process and you're on their process, so therefore we can never work well together. It's that you can work well together. You just need to find those communication points.
Okay, so this question that came in is about where the BA could, or like what you would recommend in a department that the BA belongs. This person said that their BA is in their IT department, and is it healthy to move a BA to a business area to gain an easier Agile perspective? Do you have any recommendations in general where a BA would belong in an organization to get this kind of perspective?
That's a great question. Yeah, where should the BA live? The reason it's such a great question is because the answer is everywhere, right? The business analyst, and again, I'm using the term a bit more broadly because there's lots of the way the business analyst has been defined over the years has changed slightly. Whether you're a product manager or a business analyst or a product owner or a systems engineer even that could be responsible for defining the why and the what of your building, of what you're building, it absolutely requires you to be or to have time interacting with the business side of the house and within the technical side of the house. And that is why that role is such a critical bridge. So that's not easy because there is no, you can't live in one area versus the other area. You literally need to live in both. And so I would highly recommend creating a way in which you're able to do that by having places where you sit. If the business is literally in a different building, then there should be times where you're in that building working with the business. But being familiar with both sides is critical to facilitating those conversations and getting to those core problems. You know, if you're working with customers or even folks on the business side of the house, you have to understand the technical side and be able to communicate that in a language that business is going to understand. And when you're talking to the technical folks, helping them understand the reasoning behind the request from the business side of the house. That's the role. Hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, I think that's great. The next question, we've actually had a couple of people ask similar questions around this. And I know it's kind of a hard question to ask or to answer on the fly like this, but do you have any examples of real-world companies that are using this kind of methodology or that you've seen have success with certain tenets of the Agile Manifesto?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that a lot of the customers we work with are using it. I'm trying to understand exactly the question of are they taking into consideration the fact that the world has changed to adapt the processes to make them more successful? You know, absolutely. I don't know if I want to call out some names, but even just if you look at how, you know, I have a buddy who works at Google, and in reading about Spotify and some of those examples, they're very agile in how they've adapted, but they're highly collaborative as well. And so there's lots of real-world examples out there. But ultimately, this is about finding those ways in which you communicate. So it's not a process per se as much as it's about taking the process that you currently have, or if you're about to implement a new process, if you're about to adopt Agile, consider it in today's world and consider how the technology has changed, how organizations have changed to adapt and utilize that. And there's lots of great examples, but the trick to that is, and this is something I see time and time again, is that there's definitely a lot of similarities, but every organization is different. You've got different people, you've got a different product, you've got a different, so it's so critical to be able to analyze how your company works and to work within that sort of behavioral context. Hopefully that makes sense. But I think it's a great question. I'll follow up with this. I think this would be great for a follow-up blog post or something on maybe some real-world examples.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. That was there was multiple people that asked variations of that question. So
yeah, totally.
Hearing a more expanded answer on that. So we've had a couple of questions about communication with customers and outside of the organization. And there's kind of multiple questions in here. So, like, when should you interact with the customer? How much? It's just kind of like how much engagement, like, should the teams interact with the customer to get kind of like that right balance?
I would say as much as possible, right? You can't go wrong with interacting with the customer. What ultimately, so let me state this in another way. Interact with a customer as much as possible, right? The nuance to that will be, what do you plan on doing with the information, or what is it you're trying to learn from interacting with the customer? Once you understand that first, then you can sort of determine how and when you want to interact with the customer, right? Because, again, this goes back to that idea that customers, and it depends on your customers, oftentimes want something that they think they need. It's the role of the business analyst or the product manager to understand the pain point or the problem that they're experiencing in order to think abstractly about what the solution might look like, right? It may be that the customer is exactly spot on, like we need X, Y, and Z, and yes, providing X, Y, Z is going to be great. But it's important to group and categorize that information. This, again, goes back to the importance of data, because as you're interacting and working with your customers, being able to group and categorize and segment them, to be able to say, all right, we've got a group of customers over here that are experiencing these problems, and we think that this solution is going to solve their problem. That's the complexity of the world, is being able to, because if you're simply interacting with customers, it's going to feel overwhelming, right? But you don't want to limit that interaction or limit the customer's ability to interact. You want to be able to do that, but you've got to somehow find a way to categorize and group that information, whether it's through forums, through customer advisory boards, through market research, however that is being funneled into a way in which you can look at the information in a very sort of analytical way, but also in a way that helps you understand what are the problems and what are the priorities. Because as a business analyst as well, you're responsible for prioritizing and determining which thing is more important versus another. And you don't want to get caught up in the notion of, well, customer X wants this because they're our best high-paying customer. You could be missing a lot of other things that will solve their problem as well.
So since we're 2 minutes past the hour, I think we're going to wrap up. There were a ton of excellent questions that we weren't able to get to, so we appreciate your questions, and we will follow up with you offline on those to make sure that you get an answer, or I'll make sure Derwin sees these questions, elaborate on any thoughts he has.
Yeah, I'd love to go through them.
Ben, if you want to go ahead and wrap up.
Yeah, thank you, Ashley. Thank you, Derwin, for a very informative presentation. Thank you to everyone for attending today's Modern Analyst webinar. I wanted to point out that the webinar, along with the slides, will be archived at ModernAnalyst.com within a few days. This concludes today's event, and we hope you have a great day.
Thank you, everybody.